foreign policy advisor to the Obama campaign and a former State Department official. You know, David, reports say that these protests have now spread to several cities, that these demonstrators are angry at the regime for what happened. I mean, this really is a black eye on that theocratic regime. We're looking at some of the protests now, and they're chanting, Khomeini, resign, we are the people, we're not thugs, death to the dictator, death to the oppressor, Shah or Khomeini. I'm just getting some in right now. The game is over. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, resign, resign. Khomeini, shame on you, leave the country alone. What does it mean when the people in Iran are coming out, as they have been the past few months, protesting against this notorious, despicable regime?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. You know, Iran was engulfed by protests before we killed Qasem Soleimani. And then those protests halted for a while, and there were anti-American protests, and there were demonstrations that were mourning for Qasem Soleimani. But now that we have more information about what happened with this Ukrainian airliner, and Iran has admitted they were at fault, and it was tragic, and many people were killed, the protests against the Iranian regime have now resumed. And they are widespread and they are significant. Will they continue? I expect they will. But will it make a difference? Can it result in regime change? It's probably unlikely, but it is also destabilizing Iran. The other thing that's very interesting is that Iran did these missile attacks against U.S. targets in Iraq in order to show strength, to have a showing of force. But with the missiles all missing, either mistakenly or maybe purposefully, and them now accidentally shooting down an airliner, which they've admitted to, they look rather bungling. The armed forces look anything but strong.
You know, you talk about the protests on the streets. Remember back in 2009, with the Green Revolution, President Obama, your former boss, at first did not come out strongly. What can the President of the United States now do to perhaps encourage these protests? Would we be at a tipping point at some point against the regime? The president just tweeted out, let me just read you one. The government of Iran must allow human rights groups to monitor and report facts on the ground on the ongoing protests by the Iranian people. There can not be another massacre of peaceful protesters or an internet shutdown. The world is watching this after the regime killed, we are told, at least 1,500 of these innocent young men and women and children who were protesting against them.
Well, I think President Trump and the administration would be missing a chance to support the protesters if they don't suggest that they support them, that they support human rights, as the tweet you just mentioned suggested, and do other things to try and inspire the protesters, and
like
maybe
what?
Even give some sort of...
What do you suggest?
You could give support to some of the groups that are protesting. There's never going to be a regime change unless there's a fortified opposition, which there is not in Iran right now. So there could be clandestine.
You have several groups. You got the National Council of Resistance of Iran. You've got people who follow the Shah. But let me just show you something that's just amazing. Look at this tweet. If you have a monitor there, it's in Farsi. The President of the United States tweeting to the Iranian people in Farsi. Talk about trying to lead freedom and democracy and trying to reduce and end the chokehold of the mullahs on the throat of the innocent Iranian people. This says, quote, I'm going to translate it, to the brave and suffering Iranian people, I have stood with you since the beginning of my presidency, and my government will continue to stand with you. We are following your protests closely. Your courage is inspiring. This is the president basically supporting and encouraging these protests against that regime.
Well, I think President Trump is making a wise decision there by conveying that message. It's important that we convey it. I think you're right that President Obama probably didn't do enough in the protests when they happened during his presidency. But even just conveying that message is not going to be enough to move forward towards regime change. The United States has to be careful. We don't want to seem like we're behind an effort for regime change. The effort for regime change has to be organic, and we see the seed of that in these protests. But behind the scenes, quietly, we could also be trying to support some forces, some real opposition groups that have a chance to cause regime change. There's also change at the ballot box, right? Iran doesn't have free and fair elections, but we could do everything we can to try and push for Iran to make their next set of elections more fair, and also lean on the EU and the UN and even Russia and China to do more to pressure Iran to have a more open system where people have a better choice about who they're going to elect to lead their country.
Well, let's see if that ever happens. It's not going to happen with these folks. I mean, it's not going to happen with the regime that's in place right now. We will see how these protests play out and what actions there are. The president, though, clearly standing with the people on the streets. David Tafuri, good to see you. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Arthel?
All right.